There's a strange kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep. It comes from trying to prove that you're not lazy, that you're always moving, always building, always one step ahead. You set the alarm earlier, you skip lunch, you cut sleep down to 4 hours a night. You're praised for being driven, admired for being unstoppable. But slowly, something shifts. Your energy runs low, your creativity dries up, and yet you feel guilty for stopping. You start to wonder, if I rest, will I fall behind? If I slow down, will I lose my chance? And that's when the question becomes painful. Why am I tired, not just in my body, but in my soul? You didn't invent this mindset. It came from somewhere. It came from a quote that once lit a fire in millions of young people chasing success. Hustle hard, sleep later. Let's take a closer look at how that sentence shaped a generation and why it might be time to see it in a new light. Hustle hard, sleep later. 4 words that became a mantra for a generation. They didn't come from a sacred text or a psychology book. They rose from the energy of early-stage entrepreneurs, startup founders, and self-made influencers who wanted more than just a job. They wanted to build something big, something fast, something on their own terms. This phrase became popular in the 2010s, echoing through TED Talks, startup conferences, and the social media pages of entrepreneurial icons like Gary Vaynerchuk. It embodied grit, urgency, and sacrifice. The idea was simple. If you want to succeed, you need to want it more than anyone else. And that means giving up comfort, giving up sleep, outworking everyone around you. To many, it was thrilling. For first-generation college students, immigrants chasing the American dream, or teens building their first side hustle in their parents' garage, hustle hard, sleep later, felt like a lifeline. It gave purpose to their exhaustion. It reframed pain as proof of progress. It also offered something deeper, control. In a world where so much seemed out of reach, wealth, status, freedom, this quote said, "You can earn it if you want it bad enough. No connections? No problem. No degree? Work harder." The hustle mindset democratized ambition, and for a while, it worked. The early adopters became success stories. They made headlines, raised millions, inspired others to follow. And so the quote grew louder. It moved from the tech world into broader culture, fitness, content creation, finance, even education. Sleep is for the weak became a badge of honor. If you rested, you weren't serious. If you slowed down, you weren't hungry enough. Schools started praising the most productive students, those who juggled full AP loads, clubs, sports, and side projects. Job interviews began to expect passion to look like overwork. And somewhere in that race, a new belief took root. If you're not burning out, you're not trying hard enough. But here's what the quote never mentioned: that not everyone who hustles wins, that not every late night brings clarity, that sometimes all that effort doesn't move you forward, it just breaks you down. And still, we held on to it, not because it was always true, but because letting go of it felt like failure. We feared what rest might say about us. We feared we'd become invisible. But eventually, something started to crack. The people who lived by this mantra the longest began to speak up, not in the way they once did, celebrating their 18-hour workdays, but in a quieter, more honest tone. They spoke of anxiety, insomnia, burnout, depression, Some walked away entirely. Others had no choice. Their bodies gave out first. The hustle culture that once felt like empowerment started to feel more like entrapment. And the very quote that once pushed us forward now held us hostage. It's not that the words were malicious. They were born from ambition, from struggle, from belief in potential. But, like any belief taken too far, they became rigid, absolute. And in being treated as universal truth, they lost sight of individual context. Because not every season of life is meant for sprinting. Not every person finds meaning in motion. And not every dream requires exhaustion to be real. So now we're at a turning point. Not just culturally, but personally. We've reached the moment when the question must be asked. What happens when the very thing that used to fuel you begins to drain you? That question leads us to the next part of this story, where we explore how a well-meaning slogan became a silent burden. Not for everyone, but for many, and maybe for you. At first, the pressure to hustle felt like pride, like purpose. But over time, it began to mutate. It no longer felt like a choice but a condition of worth. You wake up tired, but keep going. You cancel dinner, skip weekends, postpone vacations because this is the grind phase. You tell yourself it'll be worth it, that once you make it, you'll rest. But what happens when the finish line keeps moving? Many people began to notice that hustle hard wasn't a temporary season. It was becoming a permanent identity. One that demanded constant output. One that rewarded burnout with likes, retweets, and praise until it didn't. The signs are subtle at first. You lose track of days. Your body tightens. Your sleep fragments. You become short with loved ones, distracted, even in moments meant to be restful. Eventually, even your wins stop feeling like wins, because you're too exhausted to enjoy them. Psychologists call this toxic productivity, when achievement is no longer tied to growth, but to survival. You work not because you're excited, but because stopping feels dangerous. Because deep down, you've tied your self-worth to how much you can endure. Stories of burnout are everywhere, but many go unheard. Because in hustle culture, there's no room for pause. You don't want to be the weak link. You don't want to admit you're overwhelmed. Take the case of James, a 27-year-old product manager. He rose quickly at his startup, pulling 14-hour days, saying yes to every request. People praised his hustle, called him a machine. But 3 years in, he began having panic attacks, then blackouts. His doctor told him, "Your body is shutting down from chronic stress." Or Melissa, a small business owner who launched a handmade brand during the pandemic. She built it from scratch, packaging every order herself, replying to emails at 2 a.m. Sales grew fast, but so did her anxiety. She admitted, "I couldn't tell if I loved what I was doing or if I was just addicted to being busy." And they're not alone. A 2023 Gallup report found that over 44% of workers globally experience daily stress higher than ever before. In particular, Millennials and Gen Z report the highest levels of emotional exhaustion. They were raised on the internet, inspired by stories of overnight success, but now live with constant pressure to be on all the time. Why is this happening? Because hustle culture doesn't account for humanity. It forgets that people are not machines. We are cyclical. We get tired. We need rest not as a reward, but as a rhythm. And yet, sleep later implies that rest is optional, that it's a luxury. But science tells us otherwise. Lack of sleep affects decision-making, emotional regulation, memory, and immune health. When we skip sleep to hustle, we're not just risking burnout, we're diminishing the very capacity we need to succeed. The irony? Many of the figures who once preached non-stop hustle are now walking it back. Gary Vaynerchuk himself, in recent years, has said, "You need to love your process, not kill yourself with it." Even the biggest believers are realizing relentless drive without restoration doesn't scale, it breaks. But for many people, this realization comes late after damage is done, because there's no built-in exit in hustle culture, no graceful off-ramp. There's only go harder or disappear. So where does that leave us? With a generation that is tired, not lazy, not entitled, tired from years of chasing, proving, performing. And from within that fatigue, a new voice is starting to emerge. A voice that isn't angry but questioning. Not rejecting hard work but re-examining the cost. Because even if we once believed in hustle hard, sleep later, there comes a time when the cost of that belief becomes too visible to ignore. And that's where the next chapter begins. When the slogans fade and the exhaustion speaks louder, how are young people responding? That's what we'll explore next. The shift didn't come from rebellion. It came from exhaustion. Quiet, collective, undeniable exhaustion. Young people began to look around and realize, maybe it's not me. Maybe the system is broken. They had tried the hustle. They had believed the slogans. But instead of breakthroughs, they found burnout. Instead of freedom, they felt trapped inside endless productivity loops, always doing, never arriving. So they began to make different choices. Small ones at first. Deleting email apps from their phones. Saying no to weekend calls. Leaving the office at 5 without guilt. And eventually, bigger ones. Quitting jobs that glorified overwork. Turning down promotions that came with life-altering demands. Choosing careers not for prestige but for peace. These weren't acts of laziness. They were acts of preservation. Because at some point, people began to ask a harder question. What's the point of success if you're too tired to feel it? This marked the rise of a new mindset. Not anti-work, but anti-depletion. Not anti-hustle, but pro-sustainability. Movements like quiet quitting and soft life entered the mainstream not as trends, but as signals. Signals that people were reevaluating what it means to live well. Instead of chasing endless growth, Gen Z and younger millennials started redefining success. A job that pays enough without costing your mind. Time for hobbies that don't generate income. The courage to rest, even when others keep running. Social media began reflecting this shift. Where once it was filled with clips of 4 a.m. routines and grind set montages, now there are creators talking about burnout, therapy, and healing. Viral posts say things like, "Your productivity does not determine your worth. Rest is not a reward. It's your right." The language is changing, and so is the energy. But this doesn't mean young people don't work hard. They do. They just want to work differently. They value depth over speed, alignment over adrenaline. Instead of juggling 5 projects at once, they seek flow of the kind that lets you work with clarity, not panic. Instead of romanticizing chaos, they romanticize boundaries. Of course, not everyone understands this shift. Older generations, raised in scarcity and shaped by survival, sometimes see it as entitlement. They mistake rest for laziness. They hear mental health day and roll their eyes. But for younger generations, this isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. They've seen what happens when you ignore your body, when you glorify burnout. They grew up watching adults collapse from stress. And they're saying, "Not me, not like that." Still, it's not always easy to walk away from hustle culture. Even when you know it's hurting you, there's a part of you that whispers, "You're falling behind, you're wasting time, you're being weak." That's the internal battle many face today. The desire to slow down versus the fear of becoming irrelevant. The longing for peace versus the pressure to prove. And in this tension, something beautiful is happening. People are learning that stepping back doesn't mean giving up. That pausing doesn't mean you're lost. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose yourself. This generation is not rejecting ambition. They're rebuilding it on better ground. One where rest and resilience can exist together. Where you don't have to destroy yourself to matter. Where your energy is precious, not proof of loyalty to some invisible hustle god. So what does this new foundation look like? What values are emerging in place of the old grind? That's where we go next. In place of hustle till you drop, a quieter, steadier rhythm is emerging. This new value system doesn't reject ambition, it redefines it. It no longer treats exhaustion as a badge of honor. Instead, it views well-being as the foundation of meaningful work. The shift is subtle but profound. Where hustle culture says, "Keep going no matter what," this new mindset asks, "At what cost?" Where it once glorified all-nighters and 70-hour weeks, now it uplifts deep focus, intentional rest, and emotional regulation. Because people are realizing clarity comes not from running harder, but from knowing when to stop. This system honors internal alignment over external applause. It allows room for silence, boredom, and space things hustle culture called wasted time. But that creativity and healing quietly require more and more. You'll hear phrases like, "Discipline isn't pushing through pain, it's knowing when to pause." Success isn't speed, it's staying in the game long enough to enjoy it. Burnout isn't a face, it's a warning light. We're not talking about lowering standards. We're talking about elevating what counts. Instead of asking, "How much can I do?" people are asking, "What really matters to me, and how do I build a life that protects that?" It's not an escape, it's an evolution. But even with this new perspective, the old voices still echo. There's still doubt, still guilt, especially from those who spent years pushing themselves past the edge. And that's why the final step isn't just setting new goals, it's healing from the old ones. Let's close this story where many people quietly stand today, at the edge of ambition and identity, learning to live without the need for constant approval. Not every quote that once inspired us needs to be erased, but some need to be outgrown. Hustle hard, sleep later. Those words carried fire. They pushed people through fear, poverty, and self-doubt. But when carried too far, they also fed a culture that mistook burnout for bravery. We now know sleep isn't weakness. Rest isn't laziness. They are acts of wisdom, of resistance, of self-respect. Ambition still matters. But if it costs your peace, your health, your joy, then it's not success. It's sacrifice. We don't need to hustle harder to prove our worth. We need to build lives that reflect it. Lives where effort is honored, but not idolized. Where rest is integrated, not postponed. where becoming someone we're proud of doesn't require becoming someone we don't recognize. So if you're tired not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, you're not broken. You're waking up. And that is a powerful place to begin again. In the next video, we'll explore another famous quote that sounds kind, even noble, but might be holding you back in ways you've never noticed. Until then, thank you for being here. If something in this video resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to continue reflecting together, you know what to do. Subscribe, share, or simply stay curious. Your time matters. Thanks for spending some of it with me.